Well, I think of Edgar Keret as both an international writer and a very specifically Israeli writer. And I guess it's what I'm always telling my writing students: you have to be local in order to be international, or to be universal. But I think Miriam can explain in a very specific way in what way he represents something new in Israeli literature. As I mentioned in my brief essay in this booklet, he definitely is a kind of break from the first, you might say, idealistic kibbutznik literature, and from people like Shabtai and Agnon, and then Amos Oz. His writing has a very different quality, and I think, for instance, Amos Oz has praised him, and A.B. Yehoshua has dispraised him. So, in some ways, he's both a new voice and a threat to the way things were done in Israeli literature. And he's also somewhat, he himself feels more connected at times to Jewish American writers than he does to other Israeli writers. So how do you situate him, Miriam, in the context of Israeli literature?
I have to start out by saying, excuse me, that I'm not an expert on Israeli literature. In fact, I'm not an expert on literature at all, although I'll try to answer the question. I'm a quasi-expert on translation, if that, but as someone who reads, I can comment. And I have translated Agnon, and I have translated very other Israeli authors, so I'll approach it from that vantage point. I don't know if he's a threat, but he certainly diverges from the collectivist ethos of previous generations, and is very much about individuals and about the little guy who is kind of confused and overwhelmed by what's going on in the world around him, and trying to reconcile his own fears with the need for order and for peace and peace of mind and so on. And all of the stories, the very fact that they're so short and with this very wry and understated humor, already makes them quite different from these grand epics of the previous generation.
It's interesting that you say that he's a break from the collectivist, because in some ways he is also very much a spokesman for a generation. Now maybe it's a spokesman for a non-collectivist generation, but there is something about his work that he doesn't try to build complex characters, and indeed he can't within a space of 2 to 5 pages. You know, that's not what he's about. But he gets slivers, and there's a way in which they all represent a kind of mass man, I would say. So they may not be collectivists, but for instance, his characters are very much in sync with pop culture. They're overgrown adolescent boys who are obsessed with potato chip models, and so in a way they're not collectivists in terms of following out some political dream, but they also are in some ways very much a product of mass culture. Their imaginations have been colonized by movies and pop music. So, do you want to say something about that?
I suppose. I mean, these stories, which I see as vignettes, many of them, are essentially, I don't know if he sees himself as representing the Israeli collective or the overgrown adolescents. I mean, we're all overgrown adolescents in some respects, aren't we? So he's basically speaking, I think, on a much more individual level. But I feel uncomfortable trying to say what Edgar Keret is trying to do. I mean, he would do that much better than I could. The way I read it, there are little stories about little people overwhelmed in a very complicated, confusing, bizarre, unpredictable ambience, which is the world in general and Israel in particular, which happens to be just a little bit more confusing and overwhelming than many other places. So I see it as stories of overgrown adolescents, among others, and people who admire potato chip models, among other types, but also of people who are very often contemplating suicide, very often so uncertain of where they're going that they're completely stuck. So it's on many different levels. And I don't know if he sees himself as representing a collective or if he's just verbalizing the kind of angst that is so typical of his characters.
Yeah, well, part of the angst, I think, is there's this curious kind of split, you might say, in that there's something kind of fanciful, humorous, charming, winsome about his stories, and then there's this streak of brutality that the characters are always almost shocked into. So obviously, some of that comes from the universal conscription that everybody goes into the army, or almost everybody, and then they have this experience, and then they get out of the army and they try to suppress that experience in a way. We've been, many of us have seen the movie Waltz with Bashir, which is about forgetting and the trauma of amnesia and recovered memory vis-a-vis being in the army, so he manages to walk that tightrope very successfully of being both on the one hand very charming and winsome, and I think of the stories where people float into up to the ceiling, or there's something like a Chagall, the famous painting of the bride and the bridegroom. So there is this kind of you might say Jewish surrealism, but then suddenly people start beating each other's brains out,
Let me try to make a connection between the two parts of what you were just saying. You mentioned the army. On one level, as a translator, when I translate his stories, and I didn't serve in the army, I got married very young and I didn't get to that point. But on one level, I say, well, what's the reader outside of Israel going to understand if we use all this terminology from the army and ranks and situations and so on from the army? But that's the easy part. The more difficult part is, what does army service under the circumstances in Israel today do to the psyche of the young Israeli? And that is much more difficult to convey because it's completely under the surface. But then when you get to the scenes where they're beating one another's brains out or whatever, I sometimes make the connection to all this the desensitizing experience that comes with serving in the army, regardless of which side of the political spectrum you're on or whatever. But I mean, the very effect of that experience comes across in many of his stories. I don't know to what extent it comes across to a non-Israeli reader.
Oh, it does. I mean, I think, well, obviously, we all deal with desensitization on some level, and having to turn off both our consciousness and our conscience in some way, faced with evil in the world. So I think that that as much as anything, that's something that speaks to international readers, and I think it's remarkable the way he starts out with that plateau of numbness, you might say, and then these shards of feeling come in. Like there's a story about a bus. The buses. What's
died.
It called?
The night the buses died. The night the buses died.
The night the buses died, and they were all, and the buses are not coming, and then there are these corpses in the street, and the narrator says, I don't know why, but suddenly I felt sad. As though he was surprised by his own sadness, even though there are corpses all around him.
Yeah.